You would have heard of examples of how the N13 could have been used in the past. These rules shouldn't matter. It's people and people, and in my mind, I really just try and continue to deal that way. Yes, there's contracts, but if you have to rely on the contracts, as of right now, technically the tenant does have the right to come back, but they're proposing some changes to that. Welcome back to the REI Hot Seat. Andrew Hines here to talk to you today about Ontario strengthening protections for tenants. Now, if you're anything like me, you hear that and you wonder if they got that wrong and they meant to say landlords, but no, they did in fact say tenants and did in fact increase tenant rights in what some would argue to be one of the most tenant-friendly places in North America, I suppose. I'm sure, correct me in the comments if there's a more tenant-friendly place in North America. I'm sure there's some cities that would fall into that category. So anyways, what I wanted to do is just break down what was actually discussed and mentioned so that we sort of can demystify it and figure out, is Ontario really against landlords? What's your opinion on this? Let me know in the comments, and then let's go ahead and let's look through this. So just taking a look at the news release right on the ontario.ca website, they've basically starting off with that they're taking steps to improve the situation for landlords in adjudication, because in my circles, I know of many landlords who are talking about 12 months plus of having a tenant in place who's not paying rent. So imagine being a small-time landlord. You don't have a whole lot of extra money in the bank, and your rental property was supposed to help pay your mortgage. Well, now you're paying your mortgage and your rental property mortgage out of your income. For some people, that's a real bad scenario. So naturally, something needed to be done about that. Call me old fashioned, but I've always been of the opinion that if two people have a contract together, that they should just honor that contract. And if they don't, they no longer do business together. But I guess that's a little too old fashioned for modern day. So anyways, residents and rental housing providers deserve fast results, and government bureaucracy should not stand in the way of that. I couldn't agree more. So basically what it's saying is that they're going to invest a bunch of money into it. There's going to be more people hired. Now, on the tenant side of things, when evicting, so the big thing here is renovictions. So they don't like renovictions where the landlord will present the tenant with an N13 saying that you need to vacate the unit so I can rent it. As of right now, technically the tenant does have the right to come back, but they're proposing some changes to that. So if you've listened to my podcast or you've followed the REI Hot Seat for a while, you would have heard of examples of how the N13 could have been used in the past. And I've had guests come on and they've talked about how they would provide the tenant with an N13, and then when the tenant was leaving, then they would negotiate a deal with the tenant to get a signed notice to vacate, meaning that they wouldn't be coming back. And you can actually negotiate this with tenants. I've done it. Of course, this isn't legal advice, but you can negotiate an amount to pay a tenant to get them to leave. That's cash for keys. It's a concept talked about on this show a lot. So it's kind of combining those two concepts where the tenant already knows they're going to have to leave. So it sort of lubricates things with the N13, and then you get, you work out a deal with them otherwise. Now, I'm not saying that this should be used unethically or dishonestly. I'm saying that if you have a unit that needs to be renovated anyway, it's been an effective tool for landlords. That's going to change a bit, but the way I read this, it's not really taking away the ability to be smart. And when I look at these rule changes, I think that it only really affects those who are easily gotten by headlines. If you're not going to dig deep on a topic and figure out how to be resilient, then you're going to hear a headline or see a headline and it's going to totally rock you. It shouldn't be that way, because if you're landlording, so to speak, in the right way, these rules shouldn't matter. It's people and people, and in my mind, I really just try and continue to deal that way. Yes, there's contracts, but if you have to rely on the contracts, I feel that you've probably veered down the wrong path. I much more prefer to reason with tenants, reason with them about a situation. Never do anything unreasonable with your tenants. It will always come back to bite you. So be honest with them, be reasonable with them, and you'll actually have a pretty good time generally, unless you get an unreasonable tenant, which, I think we all have had an unreasonable tenant at some point if you're in this game for some time. So let's read this real quick. So when evicting tenants to renovate a unit, landlord will be required to provide a report from a qualified person stating that the unit must be vacant for the renovations to take place. Think about how many qualified people may fit the bill here. I mean, if you've got mold, that's pretty easy. You could have somebody say that there's mold. Of course, there's other implications that go with that. If there was a structural issue, you could have an engineer come in and say this building is not safe. If you're in the know and you're connected with a lot of people in this industry, I don't think that's very difficult to satisfy. A lot of units, especially if you're going to be stirring up dust, it's not safe for somebody to be in an environment where you're ripping out floor or ripping out drywall. It's dusty. It's going to wreck their stuff. I mean, I'd be interested to see the expanded version of this and see just how in depth they go. But this isn't frightening at surface level. And then update the tenant on the status of the renovation in writing if they plan to return. Again, like this is one of those things like where if it were me, and I have not yet done this, but I would, if the situation was correct for it, I would just have negotiated it with the tenant as they were leaving to get that signed notice to vacate, so that I know that the tenant's not expecting to move back. They can move on. They can go find their new home, because it's obviously a pain to move twice for the tenants too. So I think that there's a nice win-win there if you can, settle with them on a certain amount of money that just kind of covers their costs to just move on to the next place. So that would be my take. But I mean, if you were going along with the plan and offering the place back to them, I don't know that many landlords that operate that way. I think normally with the quote unquote renoviction, it's very much with the idea that the tenants most likely won't come back. And I think that still will, for the most part, be the case because these people want to move on. I don't think a lot of people want to move back because of the hassle, not because they wouldn't like the deal or wouldn't like the place. And then the other thing that's sort of new is giving them a 90-day grace. So if you give them a notice to say, hey, the unit's going to be done as of this date, then they have 2 more months to move back into the unit. That's how I read this. Again, it'll be interesting to see the expanded version of this with more detail as to how specifically this is being implemented. So high-level synopsis, again, I don't think that this is a deal breaker. It's more progress in a direction that Canada and Ontario does not need. We already have an extremely tenant-friendly climate, and we're making it so that more and more landlords are going to do what I've done and so many other people, and that's take money out of investment properties in Ontario and move that money south or move that money to another province. Well, if Ontario needs housing, they need to encourage landlords, builders, and flippers to create good quality product. I really feel that they're doing the opposite, and I'd love to hear your take on that. Obviously, there's a bit of a spectrum out there of opinions, but at a macro level, I see people share these stories, and then I just jokingly shared a story. I'm like, I think that the demand for the investing in the US Mastermind series is going to go up. And I had many people say, yes, I'm in on the next one. So not really the way we want things to go for around here, I suppose, if we're being blunt about it. But again, I don't think this is a deal breaker. I still think there's opportunity in Ontario. And the more stuff like this happens, the more that the people who persevere get rewarded, I think. So a lot of people get out of the game, reduces the competition in the game. Maybe now you can get slightly better deals. I'm a big fan of looking at real estate that other people look at and say either A, that's too big, that's out of my competencies, or there's too many restrictions on that, or anything where people can't quite wrap their head around how they would deal. A lot of investors want that low-hanging fruit, and I'll give you an example I've mentioned on my podcast. I used to invest in an area in a floodplain, and on top of that, I also bought a property that was in a heritage designated neighborhood. Now, between those two things, that's quite a few hurdles. A lot of people weren't looking at that side of the street. So I was able to pick up a deal on that side of the street for like $70,000, $80,000 less than I would have if it was just on the other side of the main street. And I turned that into one of my most profitable deals ever done in Canada for a flip. So my point of telling you that is if you're willing to kind of go against the odds and read news headlines like this one and still persevere through and still find a way to work that system, it actually just works to your advantage. So trying to put a positive spin on what sounds like negative news for landlords, but it actually doesn't really have to be. So lesson for today, don't get caught up in the hype. Make sure that you're actually reading through what these bills and what these changes actually mean. I get that the sentiment is that Canada is not landlord friendly, and I really don't think it is in general. And I am certainly looking in other jurisdictions like the US for places that are more landlord friendly. But I'm still keeping an eye on Ontario. I still think that there's great opportunities around. Would love to hear what you think. As always, if you've made it this far, please hit the like, subscribe, notification bell, leave a comment below. Just help this show get out to more people. Really do appreciate you tuning in, and we'll see you next week with Jake to go over a pretty cool deal. See you then.